Let me tell you, this is going to be fun. We really can have a good time with this. We don't have to make it boring. And I tell you, one of the ways we're going to do that is we're going to explain everything that we're going to talk about, for the most part, in layman's language. I could zero in and talk on one of you over here, and the main reason you're here is because you're worried about being wiped out in lawsuits. Somebody over here is going to say, the main reason I'm here is that I have a large estate, and I'm worried that I want to pass it on to my kids and not have the government take half to two-thirds of it, but when I die, and they don't get any of it. So I want to be able to pass on some things. Does it make sense that somebody might be interested in estate planning than lawsuit protection? But you know what? It won't matter, because regardless of what your circumstances are, you're going to understand how to play the rules of the game, and those circumstances can be adapted in any number of different ways. I love asset protection because of the amazing things it can do to people in their circumstances, as varied as every individual is in this room. How many are chess players? Now, you know, I'm not a chess player because I found out that I don't like looking stupid every time I play the game. Chess players, you got to be pretty smart. But those of you who are playing chess players, I want you to tell me, how many different ways are there for you to checkmate your opponents? How many ways? Unlimited, right? That's what I keep telling. Nobody's ever been able to tell me. But are there rules that you follow in playing the game of chess? There are rules that you are going to learn in understanding asset protection. But once you understand those rules, how you package them and putting them together leaves unlimited possibilities with which to checkmate the IRS. Unlimited possibilities for people to prevent them from being able to take it from you in lawsuits. What we want you to understand is that if you can understand the importance of the strategies that we use, it's the rules of the game. It's how you apply those that are unlimited, and it's going to be really neat. So yes, there are a few things. But does it make sense that not only are going to learn these strategies, but maybe we can apply them to whose circumstances? Yours. What is the greatest tax shelter in America? You're going to hear me say it again and again and again and again. The greatest tax shelter in America is to have your own business. What form of business then might you set up? We're going to give you some details about this, but let's just do... So when I talk about lawsuit protection, what legal tool comes to mind? This is a trick. We're going back to the first one. Okay, so what legal tool? Limited partnerships. When I talk about tax reduction, what tool falls right out of your mouth? Corporations, very good. What if we're talking about estate planning strategy? There is one estate planning strategy that I'm willing to bet that virtually every single person in this room needs. Living trust. There's another one. This particular trust can give away things after you pass on, after you've accumulated them, and so forth. The ability to control but not own significant wealth. Now you have to understand real quickly that there's a little thing called ownership versus control. You need to understand the power of entities is that you don't necessarily have to own it all to control it all. Some of these tools can help you provide greater protection from the IRS. Let me tell you something. Those of you who have sole proprietorships, do you want me to tell you why you're never going to want to be a sole proprietorship after today? And the reason why is because you're going to discover something if you go to the IRS's own website, and you're going to discover something that the IRS does not put on billboards when you go down the freeway. They don't advertise it. But if you get in and you study it, you're going to discover an interesting statistic, and it changes a little bit from year to year, but for the most part it's pretty accurate. The IRS will tell you that you are over 10 times as likely to be audited by the IRS if you are a sole proprietorship as compared to if you're a corporation.
Let's talk about asset protection here and structuring. Well, there's three challenges to your investing is the way I look at this. The first one is knowledge, understanding how to put all this stuff together. It's not so much that, people assume that you're an attorney, so you should understand asset protection. In my experience, it typically doesn't work that way. You have to actually be an asset protection attorney to understand how these tools fit together. I was talking to someone before class got started today, and he's from Hawaii, and he went to a local attorney there in Hawaii, and he brought up the term land trust, and the attorney did not understand, or actually let me rephrase that. It's not they didn't understand what a land trust is, but he said we do not use them in Hawaii. And he asked me, he goes, is that true? Do we not use land trusts in Hawaii? They said quite the opposite. We actually use land trusts in Hawaii. Hawaii is one of the few states that has actually adopted land trusts by statute. So they're recognized there by statute. So you would expect that an attorney who's licensed to practice in Hawaii would understand that this is a valid tool for real estate investors, but he did not. And so a lot of times we make this assumption that because somebody has the ESQ after their name, that they're going to understand asset protection, and we get discouraged that when we go to a local professional, that they just don't get it. And then we start to question our own methodologies. That is, am I doing the right thing here and putting this together? Well, I can tell you from my experience, you probably know more after sitting through this class than most attorneys in your local area when it comes to asset protection, because it's just not something that they work on a daily basis. And the key feature in understanding asset protection is that there's two sides to it. There's both the protecting you side and there's the tax side. And whenever you're creating a plan, you want these two to harmonize. I can create an awesome structure for you that will protect you from here on out, for the rest of your life. It'll be so tight that nobody would even consider coming after you. Doesn't that sound like a pretty cool strategy to have, that you could walk through life not having to worry whatever would happen because your assets will always be protected for you? Does anybody like that idea? How about if I told you it's going to raise your taxes by 30%? Now who likes the idea? What? Where are all the hands? You know what? You don't want protection? You see, that's the problem, is that there's some things you can implement, but they may not benefit you from a tax standpoint. So when we're evaluating individuals and evaluating what it is that you're doing with your investments, one of the things that we're focusing on and making recommendations to you is that, yes, you could do X, but for your particular situation, you may want to do Y. I've had a few clients who have been sued, and two of these lawsuits dealt with banks coming after them for deficiency judgments on loans, construction loans. Because right now in the industry, what you're finding is the federal government will come into a bank and they'll tell them, hey, you cannot renew that loan. You have a contractor out there, you have somebody with a commercial piece of property, you're not allowed to renew that loan unless you get that individual to give you an extra $500,000 or some more collateral. Even though the loans have been a performing loan the entire time. It doesn't matter. They're forcing people into foreclosures. And we've had a few of our investors that have been forced into this situation. And not only is it the fact that they're losing the investment and being forced into foreclosure because they can't come up with the cash, they can make the payment on the loan. That's not a problem. They just can't come up with $500,000. But on top of that, once they force you into foreclosure, then they come back to you and they say, all right, well, we sold your property and we're about $1 million shy on what was owed, so now you owe us $1 million in deficiency judgment. And that's what happened. I had one client, $7 million judgment was entered against him. But the fact of the matter is that the way we structured these clients, that when the bank finally took a look at the structuring that was put in place for them, they ended up passing on going after the individual. And one of them I actually put on my blog. I did an audio interview with my client, and the bank stated this to their attorneys: you've weaved such a complicated structure for yourself that we declined to pursue this and we're just going to drop it. And that's when I look at asset protection planning, what a good plan looks like, where you can bring that up. And people talk about anonymity. I don't care. I'm going to show you when I get into court, because I have so much confidence in what I've created to protect myself that I don't care if you know what I have at that point in time, because you're not going to be able to break it.
Do I need to tell anybody in here that we're in a lawsuit epidemic, or did that kind of go over your head? Most of the time, everybody knows that. We haven't always been in a lawsuit epidemic. We've really been in it only about the last 25 plus years. It's a quarter of a decade problematic issue. But one of the things you may not be aware of also is that this is a very, very highly problem incidental to the United States of America. I love this country, but we got a few problems. Did you know that the United States of America only represents 5% of the population of the entire world? You know what percentage of all the world's lawsuits we handle right here in the United States? Are you ready for this? 94%. We got a problem. And it is mostly being filed against small business owners, and primarily in a lot of related industries, like, for example, the medical field. They're a prime target. Real estate investors, stock market investors. I guess what I'm suggesting to you is that anybody who has money is now a target for lawsuits. So if you are interested in creating wealth, or you already have wealth, are you a candidate for a lawsuit? Now, some of you are sitting there kind of smug thinking, well, I don't have any money. So let me just make sure we got the right audience. Does everybody here, no matter who you are in this room, that you're hoping that by the time you die, you're worth a lot more than you are today? Have I got the right group? Okay, well then you better be concerned about this issue, because I hope you get your goal. All right, the second problem we have is income taxes. Would everybody agree with me that you could end up creating a lot more wealth for yourself if you didn't feel like you had to pay so much in taxes? I mean, I don't get too many people beat up on me on that. Usually that's a pretty good statement, right? Another thing we talk about is what happens when you move on to the beautiful sky beyond, probate and estate taxes. You know, when I first got into the industry, clear back in the early 70s, I had the occasion, by the nature of my work, to meet some very wealthy people, some of which were probably in any one of your industries. And I was flabbergasted to discover that when they died, the government took half to two-thirds of their wealth before their families ever saw a dime of it. And then I discovered that that was just because we did poor planning. Did you know that when we teach you about how to protect your assets while you're alive, it takes very little effort to put into place those strategies that will also help to make it so that when you move on to the beautiful sky beyond, you can pass it on to those that you love and care for and still have those assets remaining intact. So it becomes an important part of the formula of asset protection. Now, I guess I want to stop here for a moment to tell you that I keep throwing around that word called total asset protection. Right now is the point at which I want to tell you that most of the time what you're going to hear and be taught here, you will not hear from your average accountant or your attorney. Please do not misunderstand me. I'm not saying they're not bright people. They're brilliant. But this just may not be their specialty. I was doing a seminar some time ago for at a dental conference, and this dentist came up to me and he said, GK, he says, my attorney has told me that I'm bulletproof against lawsuits. I was wondering if you could tell me what you think about my situation. Well, I've been doing this for over 30 years. I figured I was pretty comfortable to give him at least my opinion. Let me tell you what I told him. After reviewing his program, I said, Doc, your attorney is correct. You are bulletproof against lawsuits. But I must warn you about something. The way you've been structured, you are bulletproof against lawsuits, but you will be slaughtered in income taxes. You see, this attorney was an expert in lawsuits but didn't understand taxes. And then the flip side of the same coin occurs. There are many of you in this room, I guarantee, who are going to come up and say, you know what, my accountant told me that tax-wise there's not that much difference between being a corporation or being a sole proprietorship. But a corporation is a lot more formalities and it's a little more expensive, and so I'm a sole proprietorship. And my answer is always the same. The reason why your accountant told you that is because they were looking at things strictly from a tax point of view, but they know nothing about lawsuits, so they would have never given you that advice. Because if you were a sole proprietorship and you get sued, you are a dream come true for an attorney when they pull you into court to prove to the judge that there is legally no delineation between you and your business is you. That's why Clint was talking about a little bit earlier that corporations aren't a very good asset protection. They're only liability against your business to separate your business from you. But those are not very good tools for that. So you see, my point is you need to understand that it does make a difference not to be a sole proprietorship. So what are we saying? What we're saying is that there's lots and lots of really great professional people out there that are experts in one of these three areas, but it's very difficult to find someone who is really an expert at all three. And when you leave here, you must be an expert in all three. And when you are an expert in all three, we tell you that you are doing total asset protection. That's what that's all about. Now, okay, so that's enough there. Let's talk a little bit about this issue. How many people are there in the United States of America right now, roughly? About 350 million? That includes every man, woman, and child in America. Look how many lawsuits are currently pending right now. Now, I have to tell you something really quick. I've discovered in my career that lawsuits generally are not ever filed against people who are broke. You know why? There's no money in it. So if there are 90 to 100 million pending lawsuits, where are they being filed against? They're being filed against people who have money, and since most people are broke or fall into the category of, children or whatever, you can see that those people who have created a degree of financial success, they're really a lot of targets. They're the ones that are going to be getting a lot of the lawsuits. In fact, 1 out of every 4 people every year get sued. Statistically speaking, if you did not make yourself unattractive to a trial attorney and you fall into the category of having money, you are probably going to be sued anywhere from 5 to 7 times in your lifetime. Anywhere from 4 to 5 to 6 times. It depends on who's taking the statistics. But it's an ugly situation. We already told you that 94% of all of those are filed. Now, do you think we might have a problem in this country if you were to discover that right now there are more students in law school than there are practicing attorneys? They're looking for work, right? So they're going to be coming up with that. We're going to be talking a little bit about that. So who's to blame? Lawsuit epidemic. Who's to blame? You need to understand that the tort laws themselves have changed. Let me give you an example. Right now, the main contributing reason, as I told you, that we're in a lawsuit epidemic is because of the following. Before an attorney can ever file a lawsuit against you, they have to come up with what we call a theory of liability, and you should write that in your notes if you haven't already done so, because I'm going to be talking about it again and again and again. A theory of liability, and what that strictly means is that the attorney must develop a theory that when they present your case to the court or to the jury will hold you liable. If they do a great job of developing this theory and your attorney does a lousy job of poking holes in it, they'll win against you. If they develop a theory and your attorney goes and pokes holes in it and tells them how stupid their theory is, you'll win and they lose. That's what it's all about. So what I'm trying to suggest to you and telling you that is that the big reason why we're in a lawsuit epidemic is because some very bright legal people over the last, 30 to 40 years, they have created a virtual explosion of expanded theories of liability that didn't even exist 25 years ago. And the worst part about these new expanded theories of liability, see, these are the tort laws, is that now you don't even have to be guilty of anything to be financially wiped out. You just have to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or you just have to be associated with the wrong person at the wrong time. Or heaven forbid, you just have to have money. That's why I'm going to make the same statement that I alluded to a little earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow students, if you have achieved a degree of financial success, say more so than the average of your neighbor, or even if you have the perceived thought of having financial success, that's number one. And number two, you have not done something to make yourself extremely unattractive to a trial attorney, I will guarantee you will be sued. It is not a matter of whether or not you'll be sued, it's when and how many times. So the tort laws are different. It is so different than even 20 years ago what would be held liable or accountable to you. One of the little examples I also give is that I was reading an article, and this has been at least 4 or 5 years ago, so think how much more it's changed. I was reading an article in the USA Today that was saying that if 20 years ago your dog killed your neighbor's dog, you would be liable in the courts of having to replace the value of the dog, which would have been that time around an average of around $500. But here 4 or 5 years ago, while I was reading the article, they were saying that as a result of our tort laws and so forth being different, today if your dog kills your neighbor's dog, you are not only responsible to replace the breed, but you have to pay punitive damages and pain and suffering, and probably you're going to be lucky if you get off for $30,000. And that was 5 years ago. So are you understanding what we're saying? The laws themselves make differences. One of the things I heard somebody saying is that the reason why we're in so many lawsuits is because we got so many lawyers out there. Well, I'm going to agree that there's probably no question that if you got a whole bunch of attorneys on the street and they're all looking for money or work, they're going to probably try to create some business for themselves. We call them ambulance chasers, etc. And I don't think everybody knows we're in a lawsuit epidemic, and everybody's saying how horrible it is. I mean, you can't go down the freeway without passing sign after sign after sign saying, if you've got this disease, call us. If you took this drug, call us, whatever. So we see that sort of thing happening. But I want you to know something, and I think it's really important to be aware of this. Ladies and gentlemen, please understand behind every single attorney that's filing a lawsuit is someone of one of your neighbors who hired them to do it. The general public is just as guilty. Now, I want you to understand that when I was a little boy, my mom and dad used to tell me that it was considered to be highly unethical to file a lawsuit unless it was something that was really egregious. That is no longer the case. Today is considered to be an absolute norm, and nobody feels any qualms about it. Well, I shouldn't say nobody, at least a lot of people don't. Let me give you some examples of that. There is several companies over the years whose responsibility is to do ongoing statistical research as to how the value system or the mores of our country have changed, and one of those is in Chicago. Every few years they do this big massive study, and then they compare the study results with one that they did 5 years before and 10 years before, and they compare them and they see how the value system in America has changed. I thought it was interesting that not very long ago when they did a study, they released the results that showed that they asked the question, what are the three most effective ways to get rich? What are the three most likely ways to get rich in America? And the first one they answered was to inherit the money. The second one was to win the lottery. What was the third one? To win a lawsuit. That is exactly right. But let me tell you some disturbing things. You talk about how our value system in this country changes. One of the things that they did was that they evaluated what was going on by asking some questions. And one of the questions I found interesting was they said, what would you be willing to do for $10 million? Now, that's a potload of money. Granted, that's why they made it big enough. And then I don't know how they got all the answers, but they had all kinds of questions and people had to answer them, and then they tabulated the results. But it was a little scary for me. I mean, I love this country. I think this country is a great country, but we do have some problems, and maybe this kind of points some of that out. What would you be willing to do for $10 million? Did you know that 25% of all of the respondents said that they would be willing to be a prostitute for a week? 25% of the entire population would be willing to be a prostitute for $10 million or more. Now, some of you are probably going to be a little shocked to hear that. You know, I don't know what the joke is, but I remember a joke I heard many, many, many years ago, but the punchline goes, well, now we've already established who you are, we're only negotiating the price, you know, something about that, you know. So maybe that's something a little scary about that. But the one that bothered me the most, and I think that directly relates to what we're talking about here, was when they asked the question, what would you be willing for $10 million? Listen to this. Did you know that 7% of the respondents, that means that 7% out of every 100, that means 7 out of every 100 said that for $10 million they said they'd be willing to kill a stranger. Does that scare you? Because I'm going to tell you, if 7 out of every 10 are willing to kill a stranger for $10 million, they're not going to bat an eye at filing a lawsuit. You see? So we have to live in an environment where the general public is completely different. Our judicial system, again, the jury system. By the way, the juries, they've gone absolutely lost their minds. We're finding that the amount of judgments that are being given by juries is just so out. I mean, we're not talking about, you know, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're talking about millions of dollars. We're sometimes talking about billions of dollars. And I wish that I had the time to tell you story after story. I could tell you all day stories, but then we wouldn't get through the material. So let's just kind of understand that they're there. So I have up on the board here a huge list of all the different kinds of sources of lawsuits. And this list can go on and 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 on. By the way, some of you look at that top one that says divorce. What's divorce got to do with a lawsuit? Is a divorce a lawsuit? You know, years ago, one of my good friends and associate, those of you who have talked about Mr. Minton, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him a little bit later. My good friend and associate, Mr. Minton, who is considered to be the father of asset protection, he and his family ended up being involved in a lawsuit epidemic decades before the rest of the country did, and it helped inspire him to grow up and be a lawsuit protection attorney. And thank you for him. We have this class being taught today years later because of what he taught so many other, a handful of really good top asset protection attorneys. So why am I telling you that story? Well, it was very interesting. He tells the story that one day they were doing a seminar and somebody came up to him and said, you know what, they said, I've been divorced 9 times and it totally financially destroyed me. And then Mr. Minton says, you know, we thought that was kind of interesting, so we went back to our law office and we did a really high, intense, high-powered study. And he says, now, GK, I want you to go out and tell everybody the results of this study. So are you ready to write this down? Here it is. When they did the study, they found out that if you get divorced 9 times, it will totally financially destroy you. Shocker, right? But what does that have to do with it? It has to do with everything, because in the late 1960s in the state of California, prior to that time, you could not get a divorce unless you could prove fault. You had to actually go in and have some sort of fault being provided by one spouse against another, or you couldn't get the divorce. And in that particular state, on that particular year, 1969, they finally developed what became known as no-fault divorce. And the reason I guess that I tell about it is because I think it had a rippling effect. Because if they, by the way, if you could now get a divorce from somebody without proving any fault, and there was a substantial amount of money involved, could that really financially destroy the other person, even though they didn't prove any fault, right? Yes? So the point is, if you can financially destroy a person without having to prove any fault in one area, Could it maybe cross-pollinate over into other areas as well? And the answer is yes, it did. It just kind of spread out from there. That's why I said you don't have to be guilty of anything to be financially wiped out. I can tell you stories of every one of these illustrations that goes on for page after page after page after page after page that we could talk about, and not a one of the individuals that we tell you about did anything wrong. For example, just owning an asset. When you drive your automobile down the road, is that a lawsuit rolling down the highway waiting to happen? And some of you say, oh yeah, but I got insurance. Well, of course you got insurance. The law requires you have insurance. And the reason why that's the end of it is because even if you got into a lawsuit and they took your insurance, that's because that's all there is to take. Most of us live by paycheck to paycheck. We die broke. But what if you've achieved a high degree of wealth, or you've started to achieve your net worth improvement? I'm going to tell you, attorneys aren't interested in just going after the insurance if they find out that's who you are. They're interested in going after you as well. So there's any number of things that can happen. The problems we talked about earlier. Do you remember the three major financial tornadoes? What were they again? Lawsuits, taxes, and estate planning. Okay. I want you to understand that you're going to start being exposed to some amazing legal tools that solve those problems. And the reason I like to use the word amazing is because, frankly, these tools work amazingly well to solve those problems. And number two, they're amazingly simple to implement. My point is this: don't be intimidated to the point to thinking that these tools are so complicated you cannot do these yourself. They're amazingly simple to implement. Think about all the different kinds of trusts you've ever heard of. Living trusts, irrevocable trusts, revocable trusts, spendthrift trusts, bypass trusts, family trusts, marital trusts. Wow. Is that enough to intimidate you? Can I tell you a secret? It's all smoke and mirrors. Did you know that a trust is a trust is a trust? And every single trust that's ever been created is really just a trust. And it might become a lot more clear if we go through and give you a little bit of background. Asset protection has everything to do with how you hold title to your properties. Everything has to do with it. How you hold title to your properties and the amazing legal tools that we can use that protect us from taxes, from estate planning, tragedies, lawsuits, has everything to do with how you hold your property. And the vast majority of all of Americans simply hold everything in their own name or in their own joint ownership name, and no wonder they've got so many problems of leaving themselves open.